and welcome to Patient World. Today we have this Melissa Mullamphy. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Let's get started by having you tell the audience about yourself.
That's a big one. My background is in, believe it or not, I have a master's in clinical psychology. I have worked in numerous hospitals and step-down houses and treatments facilities. I also worked in the reinsurance industry for 20 years, which is a total deviation from that, right? I had my son at 39. He's my miracle. And in 2010, my mom was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, which was a shock to all of us because she was waiting tables the night before. And it was 8 months diagnosis to passing. It was stage 3C, which is pretty severe. She didn't respond to chemo, but she also had a different type of cancer, which we found out after the fact. But how you and I come together and share the same passion is in patient advocacy. It took me 10 years to write a book about my mom's journey in healthcare, and that was in 2010. And it just came out last year. And I continue to try and speak to other people and blog and post information on patient advocacy, the state of healthcare, mental health, kind of what I call a COVID hangover. And unfortunately, most recently, my dad passed away at the end of December. And I never thought that I would be in the place I was again, as far as the need for change in patient advocacy and kind of all hands on deck approach. But that's what happened. And the part that's most disappointing is that, we were in a hospital. We had all the resources there. We had the pharmacy on the first floor, and things still didn't work out right. And I didn't leave. So I was there and helpless to the system. When I say system, I mean doctors putting in the right orders at the right time. Nurses had their hands tied, shortage of staff, that type of thing.
I'm so sorry for your loss.
I appreciate that. My dad had congestive heart failure for 19 years. 19 years with CHF is a blessing. The way I look at it, the way it's a good way to look at it is for all that time, up until the last 3 weeks of December, he was independent. He was cognitively intact. He was mowing the lawn, putting batteries in his truck, doing everything on his own. Unfortunately, the electric went in his heart. It was the pump for years, but then it was the electric, and he was going into VTAC, and we kind of found out the hard way. And it was just time, and his heart was tired, and it was a terminal prognosis.
I know that was very difficult. I've taken care of so many heart failure patients. Heart failure is like the number one reason of people being admitted to the hospital when they're 65 and older. So that's extremely common. And I can imagine what you went through. I know it was very difficult.
Well, he had a defibrillator pacemaker. And, again, this is 18 years he had it. And it only fired once when he was too close to a weed whacker because of the engine. You're not supposed to be close to it. So we were, that was great. And he had to have the battery changed at one point. That was it. But he started to retain water, and we brought him, and he was, he went in for 3 days. They tried to get the water off him. He came home, and on Christmas Day, the defibrillator fired. We didn't know how much it fired until I actually saw it. And when they tested the device in the ER, it fired like 6 times. 3 of them I saw, and it was so scary. But at the same time, I think, wow, that device has been in there a really long time, and when it needed to work, it worked. But if you watch it, it's very scary to watch, especially if it's one of your loved ones. And then, being in the hospital, the cliff notes are, we engage with hospice, we engage with palliative care. Um, they did not get back to us. I stayed there. I almost stalked the staff. Follow up, follow up, follow up. And, you know, this was the Tuesday after Christmas. And, we began conversations. And basically by Wednesday, he had started going downhill and he was in kidney failure and all his labs were off. And they gave us a private room. And I told my sister at that time, I'm like, we're not going home. And she's like, no, we're going home. That's what daddy wants. I'm like, we're not going home. And that wasn't what he wanted. But, they told us they had no staff. They needed nurses to be at the home and, the whole thing. And, um, the, the, the part that is the most disturbing, and I am in communication with the facility, is that we engaged palliative care and hospice on Tuesday, the 27th, and he didn't get comfort meds until 10:15 Friday morning on the 30th. And I was there, and it was worse than my mom. It was I can't even you're a doctor. You've seen it. You've seen um, what they call actively dying, and it was actively horrifying and actively unacceptable. And at one point, Friday morning, I'd stayed there overnight, slept there. The nurse manager came in and she's like, I really wish you and your sister had made this decision yesterday. And I had it at that point, and I just said, we made it on Tuesday. DNR thing was cut off. The whole thing. I didn't have to. She knew, but it was the wrong thing to say at the wrong time. And when the palliative nurse practitioner came up, she took one look at me. She took one look at him, and she said, they're going to get the medication. And I was like, how long? And she's like, 5 minutes. I said, no, really, how long? And it wound up being like an hour, which, given I was there and slept overnight and watched what I watched for 72 hours, an hour was terrible, but I had seen enough to, you know what I mean? But they did come, and it just wasn't, I wasn't prepared for it. And I really felt I was helpless because, you know, they legit just ignored us. We texted them, we knocked on their door, we asked for follow-ups. I asked the nurse and the doctor in charge of his case. I said, you have him on PRN, Dilaudid and Ativan. He only got one Dilaudid before the comfort meds. And it knocked him into tomorrow because he'd never taken a narcotic before, but he was in no condition to ask for medication when we weren't there. And I said, can you please put this on his scheduled meds? And it never got done. And Thursday night, when it was really bad, the nurses, again, their hands are tied. And I said, can you please call the on-call doctor? Can we get something? And they did, but the on-call called in a tablet form of Ativan. He no longer could swallow. That horrifying noise had started hours before, and they called in a pill. It was just it was a perfect storm. And again, the nurses had their hands tied. I don't blame them. The doctors, that there was a congestive heart failure specialist that we spoke to multiple times there from the city, and they apologized to my sister and I, after he got the comfort meds a couple hours after in the patient lounge. But thank you for your apology, but it's too late. It's too late now. I have another how long of being screwed up in the head because of what I had to watch. And my question, which I've posted before about and witnessed myself, is what happens when nobody's there? What happens when you don't have that advocate or that person asking questions or that person looking in the portal at labs and seeing that your kidney levels are off the chart, or it looks like you're fighting a severe infection, and how come they're not re-looking at it? Or you're definitely in kidney failure, and your cardiac enzyme is through the roof, and And the other part was it's a teaching hospital, which I want to participate in because you have to learn somehow. But when you have a band of people, I'm talking 10, 12 people, when you're at the lowest part of your life because, you're watching your dad die and they want to bring in a group to turn the defibrillator pacemaker off to watch, I just, thanks, but no thanks. Dr. X and Dr. Y, you can go, but the rest of you guys need to find something to do, but that's where we are today. And I saw it with my mom. It wasn't as bad because I think she had cancer so long and she was at a weakened state for a long time. But my dad, I've talked to 30-year hospice nurses and um, you know, I don't know if it's because he was a man or because it was organ failure. I mean, you're a doctor, you would know. It was worse than anything I've ever seen. And I had no control over it. I was putting music on my phone to try and drown out the sounds. It was horrible. It was just absolutely terrible, and I had nothing that I could do about it. Um, so
Speechless right now. That sounds like, ooh, a horrific experience that she went through.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I don't see any words that could make that better.
yeah, and you know, again, and I'm such a big cheerleader for nurses, because they're the connective tissue in a hospital. They can make or break your care as a patient or for your loved one. And I would say 98% of the nurses that I've dealt with through in my lifetime are outstanding, um, great nurses. And you could see that a lot of them had empathy, but again, their hands are tied. If the orders aren't in, the orders aren't in. If palliative care dropped the ball, they dropped the ball. Hospice dropped the ball, they dropped the ball. The other thing that I asked, because we were probably inpatient all in probably 12 days. Um, a lot of them are traveling nurses because of the shortage. So, one day they're on the cardiology unit, the next day they might be in med surge, the next day they might be in, I don't know, oncology. And how good are you at your job if, all these disciplines have different niches that you have to know about? And if you're just going from one floor to the other, how good are you at your job? And no disrespect, how much you care about your performance because you're still getting paid. And a lot of the traveling nurses are getting paid more than the nurses that are drawing a paycheck from the facility. So there's that rub there too. But yeah, it wasn't right. There is no excuse. And it comes from the top. To me, it's a C-suite thing. It's a system-wide thing. Um, my neighbor, it's last January, um, the county came to my house to do a wellness check, and they went to the wrong house, and it was for my neighbor. My neighbor was a man who had nothing, very limited family, and would do anything for you. But when I say he had nothing, he had nothing. Um, and it took me a day to get him out of the house. And he told me that he hurt his leg, but when I talked to his doctors, he had an aggressive cancer, and that's why his leg was so blown up and purple, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not vaccinated. So again, and he had nobody. So I had to keep testing to go see him. And on the first day I went to see him, he was up in the chair. I brought him a Dunkin' Donut. It was like I gave him $1 million. Um, he said, Missy, I'm gonna fight this. I'm not ready to go. Like he was cognitively intact. We were joking. We were laughing at the television, watching the Yankees, do this and that. And the next day I didn't go. I go back on day 3 and I found the same man that I was just having a conversation with, no glasses on. His bed collar was hanging off the bed. It said DNR with masking tape on his door, no fluids, and screaming in pain. And one of the nurses said to me, she said, "You have to fight for morphine." And I had to pretend I was his daughter in order to even be there. And then I'm trying to, like, find out what's going on. And that 24 hours that I wasn't there, they brought him to another facility, put a shunt in his abdomen to drain the ascites, because, he had so much ascites, and that's painful, but they're not going to pay for paracentesis. So they just put a tube in, and that was draining, which was terribly painful. And again, he was on PRN medication. So uh, by the time I got there, I told the nurse, I said, get whoever's in charge up here now. And she did, and she was a PA. And she said, he's on PRN medication, blah, blah, blah. And I said, does he look like a man that can ask you for medication? I mean, he didn't even know me. He didn't even know my name, and he was screaming in pain. And I just, now I have to be the ugly one. And I said, I am not leaving this hospital. I will pop a tent. I am not leaving until you give this man some kind of pain management, because this is not okay. And took about 4 hours, and I called his sister and I said, you need to get here. And once they gave him um, the concoction, the cocktail, you know what it is. I saw the same look that I saw with my mom, and he died the next evening. But when I say, when I wrote the letter to the facility that I'm talking with now, um, I say, I was there and I feel like I failed my dad because of the way he suffered. What happens when nobody's there? And I told him, I sent him a link to my blog, my neighbor. And the title of the blog is It's Not Okay to Die Alone, because I'm not doing this to be for my ego or to be any kind of hero or anything like that. But, the nurses, as soon as I walked in the room, are like, you have to fight for morphine, et cetera, et cetera. And, but so that's what I mean when what happens when you have nobody. And I can tell you what happens. It's my neighbor. And I don't think that, and I always say this, I don't think that any doctor or any nurse goes to school in healthcare and makes a sacrifice of the school and the bills and the loans and all that stuff, um, to for bad reasons. I don't think they're bad doctors. I've met a couple, but I don't think that they go into it to be in this environment. In my opinion, I think it's just a product of a broken system. And what I experienced in 2010 with my mom, I thought was bad, and it was bad. But now what I just experienced 3 months ago, 4 months ago, was probably even worse, because I was physically there, and, just short of stalking people. At one point I told my sister, I said, Alicia, I said, watch, I'm gonna stand by the elevator, and this person that's in charge of palliative care is going to be leaving because it's 4:30. And I stood by the elevator, sure enough, coat and jacket, getting in the elevator. And I said, hello, excuse me, remember me? And now she had to talk to me. And that's when we got the private room. But it's only because I propped myself up at the elevator, or he would have stayed in the same situation. And not that the private room did anything until he was properly medicated. The only thing it did was give my sister and I more room, physically more room. And he didn't have another bed next door. But that's all it did for us until the palliative care and hospice was actually implemented. A room does nothing for you without the proper care and medication.
You have been through a tremendous amount, and I know you have some recommendations for patients based on what you experienced. And you wrote a book. Can you tell us about your book?
My book is called Not in Vain, A Promise Kept, and it's basically, it's my mom's, when she was diagnosed with ovarian, it's 8 months, and every chapter is one of the months, and it talks about diagnosis, her as a cancer patient, what she went through, what my family went through, what different roles like my sister took versus myself versus my dad. Um, my mom, like, thinking about her, possibility of passing away, um, chemotherapy, tests, oncologists, it goes through a bunch of things. But unfortunately, and this is going back into 2010, there was a lot of errors made when my mom was sick. And, everybody's human, I always say medicine is part art, part science. There's no guarantees. And, you know, there's some big whoopses in my book, and I'll name a couple. One big whoops was, she had ovarian. Any kind of cancer, as you know, creates clots and pulmonary embolism. She had bilateral pulmonary embolisms and DVTs, and she was in a cardiology unit. I came home from work, and I always went to the hospital after work. And a resident came in and he asked my mom what her living will was, and I just happened to be there. And she was like, "Well, if there's no hope, I don't want anything." And with that, he took his clipboard and left. And I said, "Ma," I said, "you just told him if you have a cardiac arrest tonight that you don't want anything." And this was in the beginning of treatment. This was in June. She was diagnosed in May. And she's like, "Oh, that's not what I meant." I said, so I went back to the desk and I got him and I said, "What did you hear my mother say?" "She doesn't want anything. She's a no code. She's nothing." And I said, "Absolutely not." I said, "If she goes into cardiac arrest tonight, you do everything possible to save her." What she meant is if things got really bad, she never wanted to be on a vent and she never wanted to be fed, through a stomach tube. But she was on Ativan and she was tired and sick, and that's what she said. And he left with that. But what got even worse that evening is as I'm leaving, I was looking at her IVs and stuff, and she was going to bed. And I looked down at her bracelet, and her name was Constance E. Burns, and it was the wrong name on her bracelet. And I was so tired, and I had a BlackBerry at the time. I didn't think to like take a picture, or my thing was just, okay, this is a big problem because this barcode is your meds, your history, what procedure you may or may not be having. So the head nurse came in, she cut it off, put the right one on immediately, but that was like a big oops. Another big oops was she was on, with ovarian, it's very difficult for women. They call it the silent killer. She was on heavy duty chemo and she started wasting very badly. And we wanted to get a CAT scan before we did the third round of chemo because they're trying to shrink the tumor before they debulked her. So she was wasting so much. We said, if this isn't working, we need to get surgery right away, or we need to like shift gears and make a plan B. And so they did a CAT scan. And the oncologist told my sister that the tumor had shrunk in half. So we were doing the jig. We're like, this is fantastic. Oh my God, this is great. So she got the third round of chemotherapy. Then the next week, she met with the oncologist, gynecologist, who I loved, even though she always told us things that we didn't want to hear. She looked over my mom's films with the radiologist and she said, it didn't shrink at all. She's like, the chemo hasn't touched it. In fact, it grew. So now we just made a sick lady sicker. And then, so she wound up getting debulked. Initially, the doctor thought it was going to be palliative because that's how bad she was, but she survived a 9-hour surgery. And they said they got everything except the microscopic, but that was, I think, a guess at the time. And so you asked me the question, what do I want people to do? This is one thing, and this is part of the book. After she got debulked and she got out of inpatient rehab, she was scheduled to have cleanup chemo. That was to get the microscopic. And I was at work and my sister texted me, and my sister is very conservative, but the subject of the text was blank terrible. So I Googled the chemo that my mom was on. And I had worked for a fantastic employer, and I could come and go as I pleased because they know the situation I was in. And I went to the hospital, and my mom had every symptom of toxicity except coma and death, every single one of them. And I Googled it. And so I called the oncologist, and it was Labor Day weekend. I knew he had a boat, so he was going to be gone and not available. I said, you need to come look at my mom before you leave for the weekend because I think she's toxic. And he came, he took one look at my mom, and he told me to stay off the internet. And I said, okay, listen, you went to school a lot longer than me, you know a lot more than me. So with that, my mom got the second round of it. She agreed because she liked this oncologist. The next Saturday morning, because we had befriended so many nurses in oncology and they're fantastic, she called my cell phone. One of them called my cell phone and said, Missy, your mom's not looking too good. And this isn't the Connie that I know because they've seen her before. And we have orders to hang another round of chemo. And I want you to come here before we do that. And so raced over there. Another doctor came in that was one of his backups. We kind of got the same speech. We're going for hope. We have to be attack it, kind of this rah, rah, rah stuff. And unfortunately, my mom like opened one eye and agreed to another round. Well, that was it. After that, she was absolutely toxic. At that point, things got so bad that my sister and I slept there. And Monday afternoon at like 5 o'clock, the original oncologist came into the room and I was leaning up against the bathroom and he said, "You were right. She was toxic." And I didn't want to be right. And I take no gloating in being right. But the message here is, and I say it a lot in my book, you're never going to replace your doctor because they are specialists and that's what they do. And they do it every single day. An oncologist has a terribly hard job because every day they deal with having to tell someone that they may or may not survive, even young children. But you have to educate yourself on your illness. You have to educate yourself on your medications. You have to educate yourself on what tests you may or may not have, may or may not need. I also read in your book, have your medical record on hand. Some people have medical records like me. I have probably one that's probably 3 inches thick with GI stuff, but I know everything that I've had just up here. And I know all my doctors are all written down, but like those things are so important. And don't, the biggest thing is don't feel embarrassed or hesitant to ask questions, because you're asking it to a doctor. They call it white coat syndrome or whatever you want to call it, because sometimes, again, especially now, doctors are seeing people every 10 minutes. And, especially if you're a general practitioner or whatever, and it's very difficult for them as well. So in my opinion, the best outcome people have is if they're their own advocate for themselves or their loved ones, because, a lot of doctors, especially now, I've seen my general practitioner since I'm young and he's retiring this year, but he knows everything about me. And, but they see so many people. Like you have to be your own book.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience today, such as how to get your book or any other information?
My book is available. Actually, just hit. It was kind of cool. In March, it hit bestseller in a bunch of categories. It hit bestseller in doctor-patient relationship, grief and grieving, death and dying, a couple other ones. But because I do talk about, even though I have a master's in psychology and I've treated people in different scenarios, I was probably I was the worst patient ever because I was too quote unquote smart to need help. And I really did need help after my mom passed. So I do write a letter to my mother in hindsight 10 years later of what happened the past 10 years. And I am very vulnerable about my mental health and how I did mess up and how I did self-sabotage. And through my story, I'm trying to help others know that it's okay to not be okay. And if you need help, get it. Don't be like me and like too smart to get help, because nobody's ever too smart. Everyone can always um, uh, benefit from talking to a third party that's not biased, that doesn't know you. And so it's available on Amazon. It's available in Barnes and Noble. It's available at my website, which is www.melissamullamphy.com. And I'm pretty. I have you can find me on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn, and all over social media in one way or the other.
So at the end of this video, there's going to be a page that has information about your book and how people can reach you.
Mhm.
And thank you so very much for sharing all of your heartfelt information and your experience to help other people.
I appreciate it.
You have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you.